So here's our overview of the week that Julio alluded to. We're starting right here on Monday, Knaben season. So happy Knaben season for you all in Zurich. Happy post-lunch experience for the rest of you. So this is me, and my team and I have been with the CCDI for the last year and a half. And yeah, we're happy to be here and to support this amazing week. So thank you also to our sponsors, of course, who make this possible. Now, meat of the talk today. So does anyone recognize what this is? Maybe slightly unexpected as the first image of the first talk in a diversity inclusion week. I've got a siphon. Someone said for the bathroom, yeah. All right, yes. Does it look a little more familiar now to some of you all? Maybe you're starting to see the connection to the diversity and inclusion topic here, right? It's a pipe. It has a leak. There is water leaking out. I love the mix of English and German here in the chat. All right, and then here, same picture, right? But in addition to having a leak, it has also been attempted to be repaired, sort of a makeshift, right? Something just tied around. It clearly didn't work, right? It even might have made it worse because now the water is spraying all over. And so if you haven't realized on your own yet, what this has to do to D&I, what this has to do with exclusion and inclusion, this might ring some bells here, right? So this is what we call the leaky pipeline, right? So that was a leaky pipe that I just took you through the process of. And so basically what this is showing, this specific example is from the University of Zurich. So the academic Laufbahn, the academic career, starting from the very initial phase of education at the assessment level, right, through each phase, through the doctorate, postdoc, and the professorship, which is ostensibly like the end phase, right, the goal, the leadership, the most senior position within that field. And so as you see, share of women at the very beginning is even more than half, which isn't always the case. Here it's 60%. And with each progressive phase, slightly lower until this very critical, maybe key leak or maybe even hole in the pipe, you might say, at the postdoc phase, right? It crosses over, and then we suddenly have a surplus of men and much many fewer women, which then proceeds to be even less at subsequent phases. So we're down to about 20%. 22 if you want to be precise, at the professorship level. Now, is this specific to academia? No. This might ring some bells. You might recognize it from last year's gender intelligence report, right? So here again, showing the same thing, that at the beginning, the non-management level, we have an equal share of male and female talents. But with each progressive step up the ladder, up the hierarchy to this top management, right, we end up with very few women at the top, 17% in this case. And so now in both of these examples, I've showed you the most recent reports from the Gender Intelligence Report. Of course, we'll unveil the new one tomorrow, but this is actually a consistent pattern that we've seen year after year, very slow, if any, progress. Often very stagnant. So I wanted to actually start by getting you involved here first, because I want this to be a bit interactive. I'm also very curious to hear your perspectives. We have 120 people here, wow. So why do you think that we've had such stagnant progress? If you can go to Slido right now, so slido.com, you can use the code HSGDI22 or HSGDI22. And in one word, why do you think that we might be stuck when it comes to diversity, inclusion, and equity in organizations? So go ahead and take a second, give your anonymous opinion with us here. I'll show you what that looks like here. Can everyone see that? Make it bigger. So we're seeing a range of different words. I don't want to bias any of you who are still maybe entering your opinions here. We've got tradition, complacency, patriarchy, structures, biases. All right, I think I have to refresh again. Show all of your amazing inputs here. All right. Okay, amazing. Thank you for contributing with that little exercise. So I'll go back to sharing the slides. Share with you my one, well, okay, I have two words to share why I think. So for example, you might have heard these if you've been active in the DE&I space, words like unconscious bias, words like inclusion. We hear these a lot because they are important to know, to raise awareness about, to try to tackle. But we're going to talk about a few reasons why, based on the research, given that I am primarily a scholar in this space, why these might not be perhaps the most primary, maybe the strongest.
We need the slides. You have to share them. You have to share the slides again.
Oh, yeah.
There you go. Awesome.
Happy to do that.
Yeah,
I definitely want you focusing on these.
It's great. Keep on.
Focus on the ideas, not on me. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to flip the script a little here to talk about conscious bias and exclusion. All right, and so before I define these things, which I think is important for many respects, right? Because we need to have kind of a shared understanding of what these things are, to have kind of an equal playing field of figuring out why they might be at play in stagnating our pipelines, creating or perpetuating leaks. I want to do one more Slido here, and I hope this one works well. So again, the same Slido.com code. I'll make sure to activate that second question now. Have you encountered conscious bias and or exclusion in the DEI space? It could be your own experience, an experience of a colleague. If you're working in this space, a reaction to the work that you do in general. Just take a second and briefly share an example here. And again, this is anonymous. So make sure maybe if you want to keep it anonymous, not to mention any details. All right, I'll try to share that with you quickly so that you can see the inputs. So we'll view these results here. So someone assuming that they're doing the work of a secretary because they're a young female, being paid less for the same work, I assume. Expected absence due to parenthood, but only for women here. No opportunities for young mothers. No maternity leave still at some companies. Yes, a lot in the US. Hopefully that response is not from Switzerland. That would be illegal. Assuming mothers are less flexible, willing to travel. I love a lot of this. It's tapping into some of my other work on the maybe baby bias. Exclusion of non-binary people. A man getting promoted instead of a woman who had been nominated as a successor. Othering of LGBTQIA+ topics for people. Proximity bias, so many. So thank you very much. I'm not going to read all of them here, but I appreciate your willingness to share with us. I'm also very curious about all of your perspectives and experiences. So I appreciate that. All right, we'll get back to the slides. They should be shared now, right, Julio?
Yeah, all good.
All right. So to get into more of the nitty gritty, okay, so first maybe I'll say, so unconscious bias is the bias that's at a more implicit level. You might have even heard of it referred to as implicit bias. It's often tested also in ways that have to tap into this very deeper level of consciousness. So you might have taken one of these tests, you might give some of these tests if you're in this space doing workshops or whatnot. A big one is the Harvard Project Implicit, so the implicit association test, right? So since I focus a lot on gender and parenthood in my research, I can say that there's one test that focuses on gender and family, or gender and careers, right? So they try to test your implicit association between women being paired faster with these family topics and men being paired more quickly, more accurately with the career topics, right? So that's tapping into kind of these implicit associations, these unconscious biases that we have that tend to associate men with careers and leadership and women with family, with children, yeah? So explicit or conscious bias then on the other side would be one that you can ask somebody about in a survey or directly, because it's an attitude or a belief that is conscious enough that you can simply ask the person. You don't have to assess it in these very indirect ways with the timing or accuracy, like I just mentioned. And then, of course, inclusion. If you're using Lisa Nishi's definition, which is a great one, a classic, right? It's regardless of a person's background, that they are valued for who they are and also included in decision making. Yes?
Can I just say you're still showing the Slido slide?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I'm not sure who said that, but I'm aware of that.
Oh, okay, cool.
So I was just trying to give an overview of the definitions before we jump into the why. And so I talked about inclusion. So the other side of that would be exclusion. And so I guess the definition of that is often more active, more behavioral. So if you're talking about social exclusion, for example, a person is not in a network, they're not invited to an event, so very active. So just to give everyone an overview of the definitions I tend to use in this space, so that we kind of have a clear common foundation to build on here, why I think that conscious bias and exclusion might be stronger, more meaningful, I guess, predictors of diversity inclusion of our stagnation, right? So unconscious bias is actually potentially problematic because we know that if you talk about bias, it can actually increase bias in certain cases. So why is this? Well, if you talk about the fact that, for example, everyone has unconscious biases, it's because of all of these messages that you are exposed to throughout your day, and really it's at this deep unconscious level, then it almost feels inevitable, right? How do you avoid it if everyone has it and it's so deeply ingrained? It also kind of creates a norm that, okay, well, everybody else is biased, I'm biased too, which could create kind of a freeing effect. So for this reason, when talking about unconscious bias, it's important to not just talk about it as prevalent, as pervasive, which of course it is, but take that next step to say, okay, and it's also wrong because of this, that, or the other reason, right? Because it obscures talent or meritocratic ideals or potential, for example. Number two, diversity trainings that try to tackle unconscious bias are often one-off. They might be ineffective to change attitudes or behaviors in the long term. Because imagine you just go to a very, very short event. Maybe that's all your organization can offer. Maybe that's all the trainer can offer for whatever reason. These things are often not embedded in a way that makes them effective in changing attitudes and behaviors in the long term. Maybe they also didn't take that extra step really make a value statement about the unconscious bias, that yes, everyone is biased, but we shouldn't be, right? Or we should try to counteract them at least in the critical decisions or whatnot, in hiring, for example. And then finally, the worst kinds of bias, and by worst here, I mean pernicious, pervasive, problematic. They may not be unconscious at all, right? So some of you mentioned in our Slido examples that we just went through, some examples that I think would fit into this conscious bias, right? Another one that we tackle in our Harvard Business Review article is the idea that a professor has never chosen any female students, a male professor, never any female students, because he says, oh, you know, my wife gets jealous, right? Okay, maybe, but you know, you shouldn't be able to channel that bias in picking a certain group of students over the other group of students, right? For decades in this particular case. So in this way, people who share these kinds of biases, even in this example that I just mentioned, it's conscious because they can tell you about it, but also there's a reason for it. So it is almost justified in some way because it's rationalized, right? And so for those reasons, it might be especially harmful. All right. Oh, and now jumping into the other side of the boat here, so the exclusion, inclusion space, potential signals, I guess, of exclusion being a problem in the organization. The literature says that like new employees leave as fast as they're hired. You might have heard this as well. So maybe an organization hasn't hired any women, particularly any young women, right? Like we saw in a lot of those examples, childbearing aged women often find it hard to find employment. And then if they experience, for example, a silly climate, like we explore in the second point here, they might leave as fast as they hired because they don't feel like they're included. They don't feel like they're actually a valued member of the team. And so that then it plays into these same dynamics and these same kind of conscious biases saying like, look, you know, we never had any women, we finally hired a woman, and look, she left as fast as she was hired. They just can't cut it here. It just won't work out here, right? So for those reasons, again, there's a very dynamic and interlinked connection between conscious bias and exclusion, right? And finally, the business case. So I know this is often well-intended, and so I don't mean to penalize people who are really trying to maybe use this as a way into you know, making some of these important diversity and inclusion discussions, decisions, right? But once you have to justify hiring someone or hiring more of a particular group of employees with their potential to help the business case, that reduces them to a number, right? And it also, we know from the research, is a bit more complicated than that. You can't just add someone or a few people from a particular group and it's like a recipe, mix it all together and suddenly financial performance is better, right? Often it takes time. There could be other factors within the team that actually prevent making the most of that particular talent, her input or her potential, right? Could be even, right, a lack of inclusion or potential exclusion, right? So for this reason, and we're learning more and more from new work in the diversity and inclusion space, while potentially well-intentioned, the business case just hopefully isn't as, well, okay, to say it perhaps more simply, the business case isn't as effective as it's thought to be, right? So we should be at least a little more critical of using this justify diversity and inclusion. So, all right, taking the next step now that we've established some key points, why unconscious bias and inclusion are important, but perhaps exclusion and conscious bias might be even more effective. So these kinds of biases perpetuate myths, for example, some that were even echoed in the Slido example by some of you that we went through. So I'm so glad we did that. I'm so glad you shared your inputs here, because I've done some of these workshops as well, and we're discussing, you know, how do you get more women, and especially young women, into these positions? And they're saying, oh, you know, but women don't want to move. And I've heard this so many times, and it's just very frustrating, because of course the person thinks it's true enough to a point that they're sharing this as a legitimate reason for why it's not working out. But I guess I would just challenge that idea to say, like, well, is it that they don't want to move? Actually, from the research we know that has looked at this, for example, in the case of academic careers, men and women receiving assistant professor roles, for example, in a different place, if they're more or less likely to move, there is no gender difference. But saying it like this, especially if it's a person in power who says it, it creates this kind of myth, right? That adds to this hesitation to maybe interview, to invest in, to potentially hire women in this case for these important roles, right? So playing into this kind of myth. And I think this is really important to discuss not only the reality, but the potential myths, because it really, in terms of my role as an educator, as well as a researcher, I find that in the leadership space, in the diversity and inclusion space, to make progress, I guess, in terms of what we know and where we want to go, and really enacting positive change in these areas, it is often more important to kind of strip away some of those myths, whether it's conscious bias or myths that are leading to exclusion, right? Before we can really make progress in that space, right? So establishing fact or fiction, right? It's kind of myth busting. And here too, one that is maybe slightly different than conscious bias or exclusion, but I think is another myth that's important to tackle here, is one that, for example, if you give more roles to women or promotions, it's basically taking them all away from men. And I think that is something very emotional. I think there is some evidence to say that that's not the case. Right? I think if you're thinking about this in terms of the bigger picture of organizations, who do we want to hire? We want to hire the best talents, the best fit for the job, right? The ones with the most potential. This is so important given our global war for talent, given these massive grand challenges like climate change, where we really need the best people on the team to tackle these things together, right? So if we are about meritocracy, and of course in the DEI space, you have to rethink maybe some of those criteria because they might have been biased, or they might be historically founded somewhere a long time ago and in need of some updating, right? Just thinking about this as trying to really get down to what is the reality and what is a potential myth here, so that we can make progress together, right? I think in this case, it can also often quickly become a kind of inherent fight against certain groups or competition between certain groups, right? But I think we have more in common than we often realize in this space. Oh, a bit of myth busting here. Something funky just happened with my slides. Probably because I linked the reference to these slides. All right. So just building on this, right, to kind of wrap up in a little bit here, because we know, of course, you're busy people. Your attention spans tend to cap out at about 18 minutes, actually. So just bringing it back to the pipe that we showed you in the beginning, right? If you're thinking about such a pervasive and pernicious problem, such as the recently stagnating share of women in the pipeline for leadership, it's important to diagnose the problem in order to treat the problem, right? So an accurate diagnosis, just like in medicine, is important to get the best treatment, right? So so I guess the main message here then, in terms of diagnosis and treatment, is that yes, people might be unconsciously biased, but it might be the conscious biases actually that are holding you back or your organization back the most. Again, I think I'm gonna have to use there we go. All right, so yes, again, treatment should match the actual diagnosis in order to create that smoothly flowing pipe where we truly make sure that our trained talents who are pushed into the beginning of the pipe make it until the end. So, practical tips here. How do you achieve this in your organization? So first, of course, is to raise awareness. So if you've taken anything away from this talk today, I hope it's that just talking about unconscious bias is not enough. It has to be tapered with some sort of statement that, you know, this is not how we do it in this organization, or we're not going to let this affect maybe our critical decisions, hiring, promotions, whatever that might be, raising awareness. Another potential way to practically achieve this is to avoid hiring excluders. This could be tackled in the recruitment phase, personnel selection procedures. If, for example, you can include a just open-ended question, for example, about how someone has shown inclusion in their past, right? So just asking that both signals that that's something that you value in your group, in your organization, in your team, but also giving a chance for the applicants to explain, right? Because maybe they're active valuing of inclusion or against exclusion, whatever that might be, might even take on a different form that you wouldn't be able to see in their CV, right? So maybe it's not being an active ally by being a speaker or a panelist in something, but really let them try to explain to you how they've done this. Another way could be to identify excluders. So those are people who might already be in the organization, and they might be, for example, that male professor who's just never had a female student for whatever reason, although apparently blames it on his partner. This could be identified in 360 feedbacks. So from the 360s often incorporate, right, the employees, maybe colleagues, maybe superiors, right? And so including a question just like the one that I mentioned, how to avoid excluders, you can use similar to identify excluders who are already in the company. And finally, there might also be ways to incentivize or decentivize perhaps inclusion and exclusion respectively. So for example, I think Lego has been a very prominent example of rewarding very publicly and very meaningfully people who are actively including. Another example could be penalizing those who seem to be excluding. So this example actually came up last year as well in our gender intelligence report meeting that we had in person, right? That they actually included this in their 360 feedbacks and were given a warning if someone was showing tendencies or that feedback was coming back with some hints that that person might be an excluder. They were warned. And then the next year, if nothing was done about it, they were potentially moved, whether it was laterally or demoted. Right? You don't always, of course, have to get rid of these people. I mean, they're in the organization for a reason. They might be very valuable in terms of their implicit knowledge, in terms of their talent in this space. But there are various ways to perhaps creatively deal with some excluders who might already be in the organization to, for example, ensure that they maybe have a little less power or say in who gets hired or promoted or assigned to various tasks. Because that might be a key way, right, that exclusion is perpetuated in the group. So to end here, the last statement is basically to call us all together again. I think our goals are perhaps aligned here in making sure that we have the best people on the team, on our collective team, because again, if you're thinking about whether it's your individual team goals, organizational goals, the grand challenges like climate change, which have a very short and ticking clock here, right? We need to retain our best talents, to promote them in organizations and our teams. So to do so, perhaps we need to think of ourselves as plumbers, right? To put on your plumber hat think about, okay, what is causing this hole in the pipeline and how do we really need to tackle it to be effective in the long term? If you'd like more information, more examples, more of the citations, the original work that a lot of these ideas are built off of, I know you'll have access to these slides afterwards. We also covered a lot of this in our recent Harvard Business Review piece with Gudrun and Ali Meister, who's at IMD, also in Switzerland. But I thank you for your attention, and we'll save the rest of the time for your questions to have a bit of lively discussion, I hope, about some of these.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jamie, for this inspiring opening. And the floor is open for your questions. Julio, how do we handle the questions? Can you give a quick introduction?
Sure. As you can see, we have the chat. You feel free to write. I already see 1, 2, 3 questions in the chat, Jamie. You may want to take a look at those. And right now, people, you are also able to just open your microphone and ask something. We are quite a lot of people. You may want to use the chat first. Let's see, Jamie, because I see a lot of questions already. Yeah,
sure. While people are maybe taking some time to think of their questions or write them in the chat, I saw a few that were already written, so I'll try to tackle those. For example, Alexandra, thank you, Alexandra, asked, how to identify if someone is aware of their privilege and open to let go of their privilege? Yeah, so those are tricky. And I think those are actually 2 questions, right? So the awareness of privilege, I think, is very, very tricky to tackle, right? I think it's very much linked to maybe 2 things, personality and also feedback culture. So for example, people who are narcissistic, very, very narcissistic, they're not going to be aware of a lot of these aspects. So it's really tricky to deal with people like that. But if there's a feedback culture, and if you can, for example, give the feedback that, hey, you might not be aware of this, and point out maybe a very specific example where someone seemed to not be aware of their privilege, that might be the first way to really set the stage or plant the seeds to then have that conversation about letting go of the privilege, right? Or at least taking some steps towards that, right? Because I think that's also an emotional kind of process. But I think with a healthy feedback culture, that can kind of plant the seeds for this. There was one more question. Hasbi, hi, thank you. Have you ever accounted for the organizational structures and systems which were embedded? Yes, of course. So I think here, because I'm very much a micro scholar, I focus on, that means I focus on individual leaders and teams and, for example, individual decision makers and hiring processes. So I definitely recognize that all of these decisions are embedded within organizations, within societies, within historical structures that have really crafted very much a lot of the professional experiences and opportunities, as well as care-related experiences, opportunities that maybe men and women, for example, have access to. So in the Maybe Baby work, for example, we tried to account for some of that in looking at the parental leave policies, which I think were also mentioned by some of you in the Slido example. So I think that's a really important one if you're thinking about this critical leak in the pipeline that I showed you, because that career stage where, whether it's looking at academia or looking at the professional career phase, right? It's this critical point that overlaps with family formation, where people are making the decision to lean out, to use Sheryl Sandberg's potentially problematic words here, or if the decision makers are viewing young women as potentially risky and not giving them as much of a chance as men. I think that's a key critical point in the pipeline where structures and systems really have an important role. Ulrika, I'm just going to go through these until someone interrupts me. Feel free if you have another question that maybe builds on some of these. So Ulrika says, in case that the top management is dotted with excluders, what do you do? Ulrika, yeah, that is a tricky situation. And I think that is important because if there are many excluders, and okay, to take a step back, I think it's important that you're already realizing that top management might be dotted with excluders. So that's an important kind of perceptual awareness step to have. And then what do you do? Well, assuming that you're below the top management, the way the question is framed, right? Because then the top management would have very much a lot of influence over your potential to get there. I would say it might be easiest, right? If you really are ambitious, if you really do want to make it to that next stage, moving to another organization actually might be your best bet in that case. Because when there's multiple excluders, that's kind of a signal, a strong signal, right? That this is kind of accepted. This is kind of how business is run here. So if that's how business is run there, you might want to run, for lack of a better word. Daniela asks, what would you recommend when senior management is the excluder? So I hope, Daniela, yeah, that the previous answer might be helpful. If not, feel free to follow up with me per email. I'm happy to continue having these conversations outside of this space. Sebastian says, with reference to the title of the session, how does exclusion benefit inclusion? Thank you, Stefan. Yes. So I would say that exclusion benefits inclusion if you're thinking about the excluders, so potentially excluding or at least limiting the power of these excluders to be exclusive. So it's a bit on the nose the way I titled it. I definitely admit that. But Sebastian, I hope that answers your question here. So excluders are very powerful agents in our organizations, trying to raise awareness of that and show how you can maybe limit, reframe, redirect some of that exclusion to benefit inclusion. Sarah asks, are there examples of organizations or firms which work with this approach, excluders, includers? Yes, so we did mention one in the Harvard Business Review article. I mean, Lego is giving awards. Others also give awards for inclusion. It was actually a Swiss company. I'm sorry that I can't remember off the top of my head the name of that, but you can definitely check out the article. It's in there. I think also some of these themes are tackled even though they're not explicitly described as an exclusion, because, for example, I would say that exclusive employees, or excluders as we call them, are just one example of a toxic employee. And so I think that's something quite common that are tried to assess in hiring decisions or in 360 feedbacks, right? Trying to figure out who are the toxic people. Because again, I think the idea is very similar, right? If you get rid of one toxic person, it can make a world of difference for everyone else on the team's feelings of inclusion, rather than just trying to add something on, right? A little bit more inclusion. If you just exclude the excluder, right? In that case, it could make a world of difference for the rest.
Jamie, maybe it was Biogen.
Yes, thank you, Gudrun. Thank you. It was definitely Biogen. So a front runner in that field of identifying and dealing with excluders. I'm sure there are more. If there are more examples that you know of, please send that to me by email, because we're always trying to keep track of these and include them in articles like this Harvard Business Review, because I think also drawing attention to those people who are really front runners in this space is really important as well. Jody, I hope I'm saying that correctly, Jody. But we in the middle have the power to influence over time. We need to understand how to influence our leaders. Okay. So I think Jody here is asking about followership, or at least that's how it's often framed in the literature. So the idea is that, of course, to have a leader, you need to have a follower, right? And the idea that they are not mutually exclusive in terms of influence, right? The follower kind of chooses to obey the leader, or chooses to be influenced in some cases by the leader. So I think that's what you mean here. And in this case, it's a bit tricky if you're thinking about inclusion, exclusion. But I would say maybe it's easier to say what you should stray away from. So depending on the dynamics there, with whoever your leader is, whoever you're trying to influence, it's always tricky when there is that hierarchical difference. So I would advocate for softer strategies of persuasion. From my own research, I can say maybe with humor might be a way to do that. So making kind of a clearer statement, but hedging it a bit with humor, because in that way, of course, you can always chalk it off. Hey, it was just a joke. If the leader really takes it poorly, I can share that research with you. If you're interested in that, Jody, just follow up with me bilaterally. I mean, I think we're running out of time here. I see a thumbs up. Thank you. Let's see the rest of the messages. Okay, thank you, Julio, for sharing the article. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. And for those of you that want to join us on the next session, I'm gonna put the link to it right now. Ta-da, where is it? Here. There we go.
All right, so I think I'm about out of time here, but again, thank you for your time, for your questions. Thank you for your engagement. Please join us now for our next talk about authenticity. And yeah, keep in touch. I hope to see the rest of you at more of our D&I events this week. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Let me take it from the spotlight. Thank you very much, Jamie. So people, now we started our trip. And the next stop is a bit of a more individual stop. It's about authenticity with Florian Krause, and that's coming right up in 15 minutes. So that's that so-called Witzepause, as they say in German, or make a coffee and join us in 15 minutes. I've put the link there for all the sessions where you can find where to go next. And I hope to see you soon, in about a few minutes right there. So now I'm closing this session, and thank everyone. Hope to see lots of you on the next session as well. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Julio.
Let's stop the